This video is a quick introduction to classes. I have created a 2D Unity project with, for the user interface, 2 players with the score, health, and ammo count being displayed in the interface. I have created 2 scripts, and so far they don't have any information in them. The player manager that will be used to instantiate players, and then the player for creating the player class. So let's get started with the player class. I'm going to open up my player script. This player script will not be based, or this player class will not be based on mono behavior. Therefore, I don't need to use, or I won't be able to use neither the start nor the update, nor in any of the functions, event functions that are provided by Unity. For that player, I'm going to create basically 3 fields and their corresponding properties, and then a couple of methods. So in this example, I'm going to create the fields. I'm going to make them private. I'm going to create a score, and maybe originally it'll be set to 0. I'm going to create a field for the health, and maybe originally it is set to 100. And then I'm going to create one more with the ammo count. And I'm going to set that to 10 at the beginning. So now I need to start working on the properties. Let's begin with the score. So we want to create a property that's public, that can be accessed outside of the class. It's going to be an integer, and oftentimes a property is defined by using the same name as the backing field, but using an uppercase. Each property can have a getter or a setter functions. So the getter is basically going to go and read the information of the backing field when I'm trying to access the player.score property. So here I'm going to return the score backing field here whenever I'm trying to access the score property. The setter here is going to be called whenever I'm trying to assign a new variable or new value, for the score, the property score. So in that case, I could just set the value. The compiler is going to create a variable named value that will take the value that has been assigned by the user. In my example here, I'm going to have a little bit of code, and I'm going to do pretty much the same for the health and the ammo count, where I'm going to make sure that my score doesn't become negative. So if the value that I'm trying to assign to the score is greater than 0, then in that case I can assign it to my backing field. And if not, I can just have a print statement here, which I need to use the debug.log, that will provide that information in the console. Alright, so that basically is going to show how I'm going to implement those properties. I'm going to do in the same fashion the health and the ammo count. So I'm going to minimize this just to save some space here. I'm going to make the public property. It's going to be integer type, and this time it's going to be for the health. I can do in the same way, use the getter to actually return the value of the health backing field whenever I'm trying to read the information about the health. And I could have additional code there as needed, or if needed. And then for setting, I'm going to do something similar. If the value that I'm providing is greater than 0, I guess I could do greater than or equal to. Then in that case, I can assign that value. Make sure that you assign the value to the backing field and not the property. That would give you some major issue here. So if the value is greater than or equal to 0, I can assign it. Otherwise, I don't really need to do anything, but I'm going to have a little debug statement there so that I know that I'm having an issue. Alright, that's it for the health. And in a similar fashion, we're going to do the ammo count. We're going to use the getter which is basically going to return the value of the backing field. And then we're also going to create the setter, which is going to check again if the value is greater than or equal to 0. Then we're going to assign it to the ammo count, and if not, we're just going to print a statement to that effect. Alright, so that's it for the properties for now. My next step is going to create a couple of methods. In the first method, I'm going to call it shoot, to allow the player to shoot. It's not going to return anything, but it's going to shoot at another player. So we're going to say a player P for now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check if I have ammos. So if my ammo count is greater than 0, that means I actually can shoot. So in that case, maybe I could increment the score. And then I'm going to actually reduce the ammo count by 1. There shouldn't be an issue there because I checked that it was greater than 0. It's possible that after this I cannot shoot. It would be nice to inflict damage to the other player, but so far I haven't created a method to receive damage, so let's do that. And then we're going to expect for this method a number of points to deduct from the health. If I were to receive damage, then it would of course impact the health. So we're going to check the health points. So if the health is greater than or equal to the points, and I have some redundancies here in my code, which is fine, then in that case I can reduce it by the number of points. Otherwise, here I'm going to set it to 0. If it's less than the number of points. Otherwise, I'm going to leave it at 0. And I think that's about all I need there for this. So here, when my player shoots, that's the other thing I'm going to do. The other player needs to receive damage. And maybe we're going to reduce by 10 points. Of course, we could involve some more complex code than this. We could read some of the information from the other player if they had some kind of defense points or anything like that. But in our case here, that's not particularly necessary. We're going to try and keep it simple. So far, so good. We have a little bit of code in place. Let's check out how we could work this out with the player manager. After I save my script, I'm going to open up the player manager. And the player manager basically is going to instantiate 2 players. And then we'll use some key input to be able to allow the players to shoot at each other. So I'm going to create 2 variables. For now, I'm going to make them private. We'll change that in a little bit. So I want to create players. Maybe I'll have player 1 and then another one for player 2. In the start, I'm going to instantiate them. This is how I instantiate a player using the new keyword. And then I can do the same for player 2. And they're both instantiated. Now, one of the things that I need to do is start working out the user interface. Note that For the players, I have a score, health, and ammo provided for the text for displaying that information, and then I also have the same thing for player 2. So that information needs to be connected with my script. There are several ways that I could handle this. For now, I'm just going to create arrays. And to keep it simple, I'm going to create one-dimensional arrays, one for player 1 and one for player 2. There's several ways this could be handled. Connect the Unity Engine.ui to be able to access data types for the user interface. And I'm going to use the serialized field instead of creating them public, so I can see them in the inspector, but at the same time they're not necessarily public. They're going to be of the text type, and here I'm going to have an array, player 1 texts, and then I'm going to do the same thing for player 2. Zero is going to be the score, 1 is going to be the health, and 2 is going to be the ammo for both of them. So there we have it with the text. I can save this and initialize the variables in the inspector before I forget by selecting my player managers. Player 1 text, I have 3 of them. The score, the health, and the ammo. And then with the player 2, I have the exact same situation. We have the score, the health, and I didn't do the score. Let me try that again. That's better. And the ammo. All right, so now let's go back to the script. Maybe we're going to have a function here that will update, and I can define it as private. I'm going to call it update use player information for those 2 players here. I forgot to specify a return type. So let's add that quickly. And then basically I'm going to update. I'll start with player 1 text. For 0, that will be the score. So that will be player 1 dot score. And then obviously I'm going to need toString. Let's make sure that we add the dot text here, otherwise it won't work. Let's do the same with player 1 text at position 1, which, if we remember, that was for the health. And finally, player 1 texts at position 2, which was actually assigning the ammo count. I'm going to repeat the process for player 2. That will keep everything a little bit easier here when it's time to update the user interface. There it goes. So my update player info, and I should call it update players info to be more accurate. That can be done at the beginning here, and then we're going to test this out and make sure that it works. So let's update the players information right here in the start. So far all I've done is instantiate 2 players. They both should have a health of 100, an ammo count of 10, and a score of 0. So if I were to press start here, my 2 players will be instantiated, and then the information should be updated. So let's take a look at this. I believe I've saved my script. My player manager is fine, and I don't have any issues. Of course, I got rid of the terms score and all that, so we can fix that easily. And in that case, I wouldn't need the toString, but that's fine. And then the last one would be the ammo. Let's do the same thing for the second player, for the sake of consistency. And then the last one would be the ammo. Alright, let's try this out now. This should be better for user interface purposes when I press play. Now my interface looks a little bit better. It's an easy thing to fix, and it looks a lot better that way. Alright, so far so good. I've updated the user information. Now it's time to start having some interaction. So maybe I'm going to allow the first player to shoot with the space bar. So in that case, we're going to use the get key down. We're going to use the key code space for the space bar. So we said player 1 can shoot, so player 1. And then we're expecting it to shoot a player. So here in that case, we're going to provide player 2 because that's the player we're shooting at. Now we're going to allow player 2 to shoot with right control key. So if input dot get key down, and we're using key code dot, I think it's right control, yep, there it is. Let me fix that right quick. Then in that case we have player 2 shooting at player 1. Of course here with the shooting I'm going to impact the health and things like that, so for each time I need to make sure that I'm update the player's info so that I can see what's happening. There he goes. So let's try this out and see what happens when we shoot. We should be calling the receiving damage. We can observe here the console as well to see what's happening. So if I press the space key here, I can see the health of player 2 is decrementing. The score is incrementing for player 1. I'm running out of ammos. And nothing is happening because my code is not allowing me for anything to happen. And then if I press the control key, I can see same situation is happening there. Now it'd be good to get some output here provided for the players so that they know that they have run out of ammunitions and things like that. If you notice in my code there, when I created the player, I really don't allow anything to happen once I have no more ammunitions. So I could create another function there that could handle any kind of errors of that nature here. That's not really the purpose of this example, but I could definitely have more feedback for the players there when they die and things like that. But it kind of shows you basic usage for the different types of methods for the player. It shows you a little bit of how to manage the players in the player manager, updating their information as well. What if I wanted to see, and that's kind of like the last point I wanted to touch base on, what if I wanted to see player 1 and player 2 in my inspector? To do that, there are several steps to the process. In the player class, I'm going to make sure I define the class so that it can be serialized by using the system.serializable, and therefore that will allow for the class to be serialized. A little issue as well is that even though my properties are public, they cannot be exposed in the inspector. Unity does not expose properties, so I could just use the backing fields here and use the serialized field to allow for these to be seen and still remain private, because I don't want to have any kind of access to these. I still want to go through the properties to do that in my code, but that will allow me to see them. And finally, I also need to serialize the field. I could make them public, but I don't like to make variables public where they don't have to be public. So serialized field will allow me to visualize these variables in the inspector. So I'm making these two, player 1 and player 2 variables, private, but I use the serialized field modifier here so that I can visualize them in the inspector. And then in order to be able to see the different properties, well, Unity doesn't allow me to see those properties here in the inspector. However, I could visualize the backing fields. I do not want to make them public at all. I don't want them to be modified by external scripts. However, I can use the serialized field in order to be able to see them in the inspector. And if I were to minimize this and take a look at my player manager now, I can see that I have player 1 and player 2, and I can see their information being updated there without compromising any of the security or privacy that I was planning at the beginning. And if I were to shoot by pressing the space bar for one player or by pressing the right control key, everything would keep on working, but I would get to visualize those values in the inspector as well. All right, this concludes our introduction to classes. There will be more coming. Thanks for watching.